Hey guys, well, we got graunchy front brakes, which follows up on the graunchy rear brakes we had just a while back, and I knew this was coming and I have the gear to fix it. It's just been a matter of time. Haven't had a lot of time to myself, so I've got to do a trip into town, pick some stuff up, but before I go, let's sort these brakes. Alright, so you're going to need some tools to do this job. And if that's all you need to know and you can figure the rest out, then this is going to be a real quick video for you. I'm going to wear some gloves because I don't want my pretty hands dirty. A retractor for the piston in the caliper. These are dirt cheap. You can use a pair of slip jaw pliers or something just to push them back in, but this tool's cheap as. Some anti-seize to go on stuff. Rotor and pads, TRW, I think those are actually the factory OEM supplier for brakes for the Discovery 3. And DBA rotors, these are Australian, they're pretty good quality. More to the point, it was the only ones I could get when I was looking for them. T50 Torx, and an appropriate way to drive it. And the big socket set for doing the bizzo, which will start with a 22 to get the nuts off the wheel. Then we're going to jack it up and get stuck into it. Alright, here we go. .22 is snug. What's the Imperial? Maybe. Alright, truck, bend over and cough. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is get the caliper off. The caliper is held to the carrier by these pins. There's a bolt here and a bolt here, 13mm, and these are actually locked onto the caliper using a 17mm nut. So you need a 13mm socket, a thin 17mm spanner, a thick one won't fit in the gap, and then simply undo the bolt. Now these have blue Loctite on them. The caliper kit probably includes new bolts, which should have the blue Loctite on the thread, so it won't just easily unscrew. I have a wee collection of those bolts from doing brakes over the years. One day I'm going to find a use for them. That one feels like the blue Loctite. See, that one's red. Okay, that's probably from a completely different brake kit. Interesting. It was not as tight as the first one. Okay. And we can see the pistons are fully out, and we'll get to see why shortly. But for now, what we want to do is hang this somewhere. Don't let it hang on the brake hose. That's not good. So, here's our good brake pad. And here's the cause for alarm. Alright, as you can see, that is well through the meat of the pad. There's a tiny bit left just in the middle there. but that has basically been destroyed, metal on metal. And the brake rotor is also destroyed. We've just got no, it should be a nice smooth face, that would probably cut me. It's not good at all. We've got massive brake lip on this rotor as well, so it is well due for replacement. So the next step is to get these carrier bolts out. These hold the frame that holds the caliper in place onto the hub assembly. They're 21mm multi-point, so you can't just use a standard 6-sided socket. You've got to use a multi-point socket. Use a good one because you don't want to round these off. It's going to be a nightmare if you do. These have quite a bit of torque on them, and when I do these back up, I'm going to do them by hand for one reason only. I cannot find my torque wrench. I have no idea what I've done with it. It's not where it should be, and so I'm going to do these up tight, and then I'm going to have to take the wheel off later and actually tighten them up once I find my torque wrench. But for now, we'll get it done, and I'll put the torque values on screen so that if you have your torque wrench and you haven't lost it like I have, you'll know what to do your ones up to. Now, just as a side note, while I think about it, if you are only replacing the pads, you do not need to take the carrier off. In fact, you shouldn't. The only reason the carrier needs to come off is because it wraps around the disc rotor, and I need to take the disc rotor off to replace it. Right, so the next step in the process is we've got to get this T50 stubby bolt out. This just locates the disc. As far as I'm aware, it doesn't have any other purpose, and I have seen them left out before. I wouldn't do that, but you need a T50 star drive to get it out. They shouldn't be tight, but I have seen them so tight I've had to use an impact driver on them before. This one's not too bad. Alright, and at this point we should be able to just knock the rotor off. Wow, that just fell off, that's good. And then we can see how bad that is. That is shocking. Alright, so pretty much like the rear one when we did it, left long beyond reasonable. It should be nice and shiny like that. But that one, you can see this lip. That's all worn down rotor material. So, that is now scrap steel. Right, here's our new rotor. Now, really important to note, these come wrapped in shipping oil. So, when I take this out of the bag, it won't be rusty even though it's been sitting in my garage for a while, but it will be oily. If I put this on and then put the pads on it, I'm going to end up with a big problem, because brake pads absorb oil, and once the oil gets in, it's really hard to get back out. In fact, my uncle showed me an old-timer trick years ago where he sat with a blowtorch on some rear brake shoes that I was replacing on a vehicle I had at the time, and he torched the oil out. The hub seal had gone and the pads were saturated, and it took him about an hour, but he just sat there and quietly torched all the oil out of them. I don't want to have to do that. These are brand new, so don't just put it on like this. You need to get some brake cleaner and a rag and actually wipe these down and get all the shipping oil off them. making really good and sure none of that shipping oil is left on here. Okay, so your brake kit should come with 2 new bolts, as I mentioned, with Loctite adhered to it. This has 4 because there's 2 sets of pads. Also, new spring clips. These are retainers for the brake pad. Take the old ones out, put the new ones in. Now, a smart person would also check the new pads against the old to make sure you got the right ones, because at this point it'll be an absolute nightmare if I don't. I'm going to trust that I do, and if I don't, well, we'll all have a really good laugh shortly. Right, so there's the new retainers in place. There are my new pads. Alright, there we go. Now all the pads are fitted with a brake wear sensor slot at the top, but I think the brake wear sensor on this truck is on the other side, and that's why it probably didn't trigger, because the other side is not worn down as clearly as far as this side was. So pads are fitted. Make sure the meat goes to the inside, the steel goes to the outside. Right, so fitting is the opposite of what we've already done. Put the carrier back in. Right, I can squeeze those onto the rotor. I'm just going to put both of the carrier bolts back in. Right, then we're going to torque it up using the popular YouTube click-click method. And like I say, I'll come back and torque these properly when I find my torque wrench. Yep, so the correct torque spec is half a hernia. That will do for the moment. Okay, so the next step is to get the caliper and get the pistons back in, because those pistons had fully extended themselves to deal with the fact that there was no meat left on those pads. It'll never go back around these new pads, so we've got to push those pistons back in. But when you push the pistons back in, the pistons are pushed out by fluid. You push them back in, that fluid has to go back up the system somewhere, and it'll end up back in the master cylinder. So one of the things we need to check is that as we're pushing those pistons back in, we're not overflowing the master cylinder with the fluid that was in there. If that happens, brake fluid is corrosive, it'll take paint off. It's pretty nasty stuff really, so we need to make sure that if we do start to backfill too much that we extract that fluid out of the master cylinder. Alright, so the brake master cylinder lives under here, unless you're in one of those weird countries where people drive on the wrong side of the road, in which case you'll find it on the other side. Pop the cover off. So as you can see, the reservoir it looks a little low, but bear in mind the truck is actually tipped up on an angle. This corner is raised up in the air, so it looks lower than it really is, but we should have enough room for anything that comes out of the caliper here. But you guys watch. Keep an eye on that level for me. Alright, we're almost done there. The fluid levels definitely come up. When I do the other side, I'm definitely going to have to take some out, I think. But for now, let's take you back down below. Alright, so just having to alternate this side to side to take each piston back. We're nearly there. It's an awkward job. And that should be enough. Slip it over and we're good. Now the other thing you want to check too is that these pins, before we put the caliper on, these pins slide freely, and if they don't, you have a problem, because it's those pins that run right through this body of the carrier that basically allow the caliper the freedom to move this way and this way. So if one pad wears less evenly than the other, it actually allows the caliper to center up on itself and make sure it's putting even pressure. If you don't have those moving, you'll wear one pad out, you'll potentially bend the pins. You only have, well, probably less than half the braking force that you should have. It's all around a bad thing. So if those pins are seized up, you need to unseize them. The rubber boots here, if they're worn, you should replace them, because that's what keeps the weather out and stops them from causing you any grief. In this case, mine are in good nick, so I'll put my 2 new bolts in. Now, I've heard people argue that these bolts don't need replacing. Sure, that's your call. They're included in the kit, and I can't imagine they'd be included in the kit if they weren't needed. So we have them, we're going to use them. I don't know if they replace the bolts just to make sure that they're Loctited in just for safety reasons, this is a braking system, or whether they actually wear out. I could not tell you. But we're doing it just in case. Okay. 13mm socket, 17mm spanner. And I've lost a finger on my glove, so my pretty little hands. Click, click. Alright, so as you can see, this is able to float on those pins back and forth, and the first time I hit the brakes, the fluid is going to push those pistons out and center everything up, align it, and that way I'll have equal braking force either side on either pad, and that's what I'm looking for. And that is really all there is to it. If I was only doing new brake pads, if I didn't need the rotors, these two bolts are the only two I would have needed to pull out. Then you just pull the caliper off, push those pistons back in, watching the fluid while you do it, fit the new retaining clips, fit the new brake pads, push this back on, do those bolts back up. That's all there is to it. If you're doing the rotor, it's just a couple of extra steps and it's not that hard. But anyway, that's it. We're done. That's all there is to it. If this was helpful, by all means, feel free to give it a thumbs up. Alright. So, bedding in. So we've just replaced the braking surface and the pads that clamp to the braking surface. They will not be perfectly mated to each other. They should be perfectly flat, so they should, but there will be minor imperfections, and the bedding in process is basically designed to get the pad surface and the disc surface perfectly mated to each other. Now, I was always taught this particular procedure, which is to get up to 80 kilometers an hour, brake heavily down to 10, but do not stop the vehicle completely and don't hold the brakes on the vehicle with it dead stopped. Get it back up to 80, brake heavily to 10, up to 80, brake heavily to 10. Those three heavy braking procedures should bed the pads to the rotor. If there's a better way, by all means, please let me know, but that was what I've always been taught. Okay, up to 80. I'm going to do this fairly gently because the camera's in the back, in case you hadn't noticed. Okay, there's one. There's two. And the brakes do feel a wee bit spongy and not the best. That braking certainly felt better than the first one. And there's three. And we've got a wee family of ducks living on the side of the road here too, which I need to be careful about. Mummy ducks just had babies, so there's a pile of little yellow fluffy waddling balls of feathers. And there we go. Job done.